Welcome to the War on the Rocks podcast, covering strategy, defense, and foreign affairs. I'm Nicholas Danforth, editor and host of today's show. I'm sitting down here with three of Washington's top experts on U.S. China relations to discuss how the relationship is going. We'll get their thoughts on America's recent push for diplomacy with China, Beijing's response, some of the hurdles, be they military, diplomatic, or economic, and of course what this all means for the future of both countries. So with that, let me introduce my panelists. Going from left to right, we have Emily Weinstein, a research fellow at Georgetown's Center for Security and Emerging Technology, and a non-resident fellow with the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub. We've also have Evan Medeiros, the Penner Family Chair in Asia Studies in the School of Foreign Service. He previously served for 6 years on the staff of the National Security Council as Director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia, and then as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Asia. You also, I saw you had some absurd number of 7 books that you'd published, and you have one new one.
That's right. I've got a new one. It's called Cold Rivals, The New Era of U.S. China Strategic Competition. It's a collection of essays that I edited among American and Chinese scholars trying to understand how did we get here, what's strategic competition all about, and where's it going to go.
So if you have any questions left after you listen to Evan on the podcast, I encourage you to buy the book.
Thanks, Nick.
Finally, Tom Shugart, an adjunct senior fellow with the defense program at the Center for New American Security. Mr. Shugart served for over 25 years in the Navy, where he last worked in the Defense Department's Office of Net Assessment. I appreciate you've also published with a number of prestigious outlets, but I noticed on your bio that you list War on the Rocks first, which we're always very grateful for.
Well, I've had some of the best work I think I've been able to put out has certainly been on War on the Rocks, so I appreciate it.
We also encourage people to check out Tom's articles that he's published over the years. Thank you all for sitting down with me. We've got a lot to talk about. I want to start off by getting your broad thoughts on the U.S.-China relationship. President Biden recently said that, "I don't want to contain China. We're not trying to hurt China." He happened to say this during a trip to India and Vietnam, two of the countries that would naturally be America's partners if they were trying to contain China. So give us a sense overall, any or all of you, where the relationship stands right now and what the Biden administration is trying to do with it.
The frame that I use for the relationship is looking at structural forces and cyclical forces. The structural forces, the long-term forces are bearing down on the relationship. The sources of competition are growing and intensifying. The sources of stability and ballast are becoming much more minimal. Both sides are engaging in much more competitive strategies toward the other. So what we're seeing is structurally the relationship is for sure going to deteriorate. The question is it a precipitous deterioration or a slow and gradual one that's nonlinear? It has plateaus, perhaps, periods of stability. So that's sort of structurally, I think we have to understand the relationship now that it's entered what everybody is calling strategic competition is really going to be a very tense, challenging, difficult period where American and Chinese interests diverge more than they converge and on some very difficult and sensitive issues.
General, for a second, do you think the administration shares broadly that perception of the relationship?
I do. And I think that's why they've adopted a strategy of rebuilding American competitiveness at home, because it's going to be a long-term tough competition, rebuilding alliances and partnerships in order to balance Chinese power in the region. So I think they get it, and that's reflected in the key pillars of their strategy.
Emily, you've been nodding your head sagely this whole time, please.
I would just also add that I think a lot of what we've been seeing over the past 2 administrations has been a bit of a waking up to what we've been seeing China, actually 3 administrations. We've been waking up to kind of what we've been seeing China slowly do since the turn of the century. I think maybe with some previous administrations, we might have overcorrected in our response to what we kind of realized China was doing in terms of things related to industrial espionage, related to unfair trade practices. This falls into, economic, military, and technology kind of spaces. And I think the Biden administration has taken both lessons from, I would say, the Obama administration and from the Trump administration and tried to mold their own strategy that does address some of the issues that did come up during the Trump administration, but tries to scale them back a little bit and chart their own course.
So let me ask then, this is happening at a moment where the Biden administration seems to have engaged in a kind of diplomatic outreach campaign since, I guess, Tony Blinken was in Beijing last spring. Most recently, we had Jake Sullivan meeting with the Chinese foreign minister in Malta. What's behind this diplomatic push, and how's it going?
I think both countries have decided they want to move to a phase of stability. This is the cyclical trends that I was referring to earlier. In other words, for both domestic reasons in China and domestic reasons in the United States, they're going to try and stabilize the relationship, put a floor under the free fall. And so they're doing that by opening up new dialogue channels, having top officials meet one another, and I think it's going to culminate in Xi Jinping coming to the U.S. this fall to attend the APEC summit. This is an Asian multilateral economic meeting that the U.S. is going to host this year in San Francisco.
So that in that case, I mean, I guess the coverage I've seen of this has emphasized that the diplomatic outreach hasn't been reciprocated by China. Is that a fair assessment, or do you still see this building towards something that both sides are going to...
It depends what frame you... I mean, I don't think diplomatic outreach should be a sort of balance sheet type of thing. I mean, you've, of course, had the Chinese commerce minister that visited the United States. The Chinese foreign minister, Wang Yi, is almost certainly going to come before Xi Jinping comes. So, it's the kind of thing where I think if you just bean count on both sides, you miss the bigger picture.
I would also just say, too, I think there are a bunch of domestic political issues in China right now that may be preventing some of the same levels of leadership coming to the United States or other places. I mean, we're still just on the tail end of China's COVID crackdown and lockdown, which obviously made it difficult for anyone, even Xi Jinping, to leave China. And we're also currently living through what seems to be a mini anti-corruption campaign 2.0 that we're seeing among Chinese leadership with the disappearance of obviously, the issues associated with Qin Gang, the foreign minister, and now the defense minister, Li Shangfu. So I think there are probably some other issues that may be preventing Chinese leadership from actually coming to the U.S. and having those conversations.
Also add, of course, to that anti-corruption campaign, the removal of the leadership of the PLA rocket force. And quite interesting, the replacement by senior leaders from other services.
Right. So from Washington's side, we're talking about diplomatic outreach. On Beijing's side, there seems to be a lot more going on in diplomatic and high-level military ranks. Give us a little bit of a sense of that and how, beyond what you said, that's playing into all of this.
China at home is facing a variety of challenges right now. The economy is slowing. It hasn't recovered fully from the zero COVID policy as expected. So you have economic austerity, you have youth unemployment growing. These, as my colleagues mentioned, several high-profile cases of senior leaders who have been purged, maybe for corruption, maybe for espionage. It's not really clear. I think the Chinese have recognized that stability in the U.S.-China relationship is going to serve their interests as they sort through a variety of domestic challenges. So that's what's driving this new phase.
Is this likely to be, a kind of window where they go through, they purge some people and they reconstitute, or does this suggest kind of continued roiling trouble down the road?
Yeah, the Chinese have realized that it's in their interest to try and put a floor under the relationship. The question is, can it be sustained? I think that it really is going to depend on bilateral interactions and specifically the election in Taiwan in January, because, that is a major upcoming event. And I think that if certain outcomes occur and the Chinese draw certain conclusions from that, it could lead to a very negative spiral throughout the region.
Well, let me ask about that then too, because there seems, based on a number of pieces that we've published, a broader sense that the status quo as it corresponds to Taiwan is eroding. Both countries obviously understand this in different ways. Both countries are dealing with it in different ways. But yeah, tell us about the election. What does that mean for this effort to manage U.S.-China relations?
The core issue is who's going to get elected. Of course, nobody knows the question, and it's a very complicated calculation right now because there's somewhere between 3.5 to 4 candidates running. But so if the DPP wins, right? So that's
tell us who. You have to assume that many of our listeners, like myself, are not familiar with Taiwanese domestic politics.
So if the current ruling party is known as the Democratic Progressive Party, they've been in office for 2 terms. Beijing doesn't like them because they believe that they're a pro-independence party that's trying to take Taiwan independent, which is not what the current leader of Taiwan has sought to do. In fact, she's focused very impressively on consolidating Taiwan's democracy and its economy. But as a result, for the past 8 years, Beijing cut off all formal dialogue with the ruling party in Taiwan. If the ruling party wins again, my concern is that Beijing will draw the wrong conclusion that politics in Taiwan have fundamentally changed. Their strategy of both incentives and coercion are not working, and they'll really turn up the coercion piece, believing that that's the only way to get to the Taiwan people and make them realize that moving toward independence is a failure. And that, I think, would be very, very destabilizing. And it would require the U.S. to respond, right? And can you imagine a cross-strait crisis in the middle of an American election cycle?
I think the other thing that worries me about, a potential DPP victory in the upcoming election too, is regardless of what Taiwan, whoever wins the election, regardless of whatever they say, they can say they're not pro-independence, they can say all of these things. Beijing will take what it wants to in this case, and it could choose to interpret this in a way that is pretty destructive, I think, to what Taiwan and what Taiwanese leadership actually do want to achieve with a DPP victory or with anyone else's victory over there.
So I have a slightly different view from Emily, because I think the KMT, the Kuomintang, this is the party that founded Taiwan in 1949, they've had a ongoing conversation with the CCP for many years. They interact with them. And I think Beijing would prefer that the KMT candidate get elected, and that would open up dialogue channels. It would open up trade people-to-people exchanges. Basically, Beijing, while it's still uncertain about the KMT's view, does not believe that the KMT is committed to independence. So I think that, the overriding American interest is a free, fair, transparent, open election. Taiwan is a great example of a Chinese democracy, and that's an important symbol. So that's the American interest. But, the outcome of this election will really, affect Beijing's perceptions, which could be very destabilizing.
And I think it'll depend too. I'm curious to see if there is a KMT victory, what happens then to the U.S. Taiwan relationship? Is the KMT as the ruling party kind of stuck in the middle now between wanting to try to align a bit more with Beijing versus trying to still balance with the United States? So I think each situation presents its own kind of unique challenges, but I think it's definitely something that will have a massive impact over the next few months.
Hi, everyone. I wanted to take a minute to talk to you about our membership program. It's expanding. Next week, we will launch a new podcast, Thinking the Unthinkable, with Ankit Panda discussing the third nuclear age. Then there's The Adversarial, a new newsletter that provides succinct analysis of U.S. adversaries, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and jihadist groups, as well as Rewind and Reconnoiter, text-based interviews in the form of a weekly newsletter where we ask one of our authors to look back at an issue they wrote about for us more than a year in the past. This winter, we're adding 5 more members-only podcasts, one on each of the military service: the U.S. Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force, and Space Force. Then there's a newsletter on cyber operations and a podcast on artificial intelligence. This, of course, is in addition to what we already provide: the Russia Contingency with Mike Kaufman, my newsletter, Mid-Afternoon Map, and 3 podcasts, The Warcast, The Insider, and Unspent Rounds, all hosted by my colleague Aaron Stein. We are raising the annual price from $75 to $150 for new members starting October 9th. If you sign up for an annual membership before then, you can lock in the $75 price and gain access to War on the Rocks Platinum. Join the tribe at warontherocks.com/membership. Tom, turning to you. You've written some really granular stuff for us about this. Stepping back more, big picture, obviously impossible to talk about all this without talking about the threat of military conflict. How, amidst the diplomacy we've been talking about, amidst developments in Taiwan we've been talking about, what are, in your view, the real risks for a military conflict here?
I think in the very short term, they're relatively low. We don't see any strong indications of imminent action on the part of the PRC against Taiwan. Clearly, Xi Jinping has put a marker down to the PLA to be ready to invade Taiwan in 2027. There have been some misunderstandings of that. There have been people that have kind of poo-pooed that as, oh, that was just a centennial date that was coming across. But we've seen very clear statements by CIA Director Burns that as a matter of intelligence, we know that she has ordered the PLA to be ready to conduct military action against Taiwan by 2027. That's a different thing and much more specific. So that doesn't necessarily mean that they're actually going to do something in 2027. It also doesn't necessarily mean that they may wait until 2027. There's been plenty of examples in history. See Nazi Germany, for example, where militaries have not been given the time they wanted to be ready for a conflict, and authoritarian leaders have pulled the trigger early. This could result in failure, but it's hard to say because there has been no large-scale maritime. And to be clear, any Taiwan conflict may end on Taiwan, but it will be decided in the air and at sea, in my opinion. And we haven't seen a large-scale conflict like that since 1944, essentially. So there's a lot of uncertainty there. So I think the risk is there. We're watching China practice doing the things that it would take to pull off a conflict. I don't think they're quite there yet, but they are certainly working on it.
So then let me also ask as a follow-up, we've seen a lot of analysis about what potential lessons China's drawing from the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Very eager to get all of your thoughts on what those are, and does that make a conflict more or less likely?
Well, I'm happy to start with the military angle. So a lot of observers that were in the run-up to the Russian election, and again, I'm not a Russia expert, but I found good people to read. And certainly what I read about the Russian military, a lot of it, while not the same, rhymed with some of what the PLA says in its doctrine, in the sense of start out a conflict with large-scale, paralyzing strikes, hold off on the ground forces if you need to until the enemy's been paralyzed and brought low, and then take your time and send in the forces once you've done the large-scale work on their systems to really paralyze them. That clearly didn't happen. Vladimir Putin decided to, based on apparently faulty intelligence information, try this low-intensity flying column, hope they all surrender plan against Ukraine. And we all saw how that worked out for them, which is not very well. I could imagine Xi Jinping watching that and saying, okay, yes, there are some lower scale things we could try to do to kind of get the Taiwanese to come out with their hands up, or perhaps some lower intensity things. But one of his takeaways may very well be, we've spent decades building this very robust, aggressive, large scale strikes type of doctrine to start things off. We built a force around it. Maybe we actually do need to use it as we intended, despite what might be the wishful thinking on some parties in the West that they wouldn't do that.
So the lesson from Ukraine would actually be, we have to do this bigger and faster and more in a more momentous way, because we saw how it didn't work for Russia.
That if you're going to do it, follow your doctrine, do what you planned and trained to do, which is pretty alarming stuff.
I think this is a very difficult question to answer because, number one, let's all agree, there's no documentary evidence in the open source world. And if you've got some, please, I'd love to see it. So we don't really know how the PLA or the CCP is processing this. Number two, I think it's fair to say that given the ambiguity, it's probably likely the Chinese at least draw the lesson, it's very easy to start wars, it's very hard to stop them, right? And I think that that's certainly a lesson that they've learned. But the thing that I've learned as a sort of career China watcher is how the CCP and the PLA perceive things is often very different than we in the United States would, because they're often, less interested in looking at something on its merits and more interested in figuring out what of the events that they're looking at will validate their own strategies, right? And so I worry a little bit about what lessons related to nuclear threats and how Putin used nuclear threats may or may not influence Chinese thinking. I don't know what conclusions the Chinese might draw. I don't know what conclusions the Russians have drawn, but I think that that's something worth studying. But the other point to keep in mind is, in my conversations with Chinese scholars, they often point out that the U.S. has not deployed forces to Ukraine, right? And NATO has not deployed forces to Ukraine, right? And they're like, what lessons should we draw from that? And if the lessons they draw is, well, the United States won't use troops over Taiwan, which I think is inaccurate. I think the U.S. would, and that U.S. allies would stay on the sidelines. I worry that there are a lot of lenses through which the CCP can distort the reality.
So a few points on this too, I think, and again, I think Evan and Tom know this just as, better than I do. But I mean, the Chinese, particularly in the military space, watch the United States very, very closely and very carefully. I've seen some of the best analyses of U.S. military action in places like the Gulf War and other places, written by Chinese U.S. military watchers. They study this. I mean, the Gulf War was such a turning point in terms of how China viewed what its own military should look like. The Chinese also are very, everyone I think at this point in time has heard about China's military civil fusion development strategy. And some of there's been great analysis from Chinese military and kind of military civil fusion experts in China looking at U.S. companies and trying to study what does military civil fusion look like for the United States. There are great examples of, studying SpaceX or companies like that. And I think in the context of the Ukraine conflict that we're seeing now, the huge presence of U.S. tech companies as military actors. You've got Palantir, you've got Starlink, you've got so many, there are drone companies from everywhere in the world. So the presence of these kind of, quote, military civil fusion actors in this conflict, I think is something that is newer. I think we saw hints of this in the Middle East, but not to this scale. So I think China is definitely watching the presence of those companies in Ukraine and seeing what that could mean. I also want to touch just briefly on economic lessons, I think, from what China is seeing in Ukraine and in Russia. We saw massive and very rapid reactions from the rest of the world the second Russia did choose to invade Ukraine in end of February 2022. We saw the U.S., a U.S.-led group of countries act very swiftly to enact big, all-encompassing export controls and sanctions to the extent that we have not seen since the end of the Cold War. And one of the questions that I get asked a lot is whether or not we'd see the same type of reaction from the international community in the instance that China does choose to invade Ukraine. And I think it's really hard to say, but I worry that for a whole bunch of reasons, we may not see the same type of reaction, partly because of the heavy economic presence, or U.S.'s heavy economic presence in China. Before Russia invaded Ukraine, I mean, there were U.S. companies that did operate in Russia. A lot of them have made, moral decisions to remove themselves from Russia. At least we did see a lot of them also doing it just because of sanctions and export controls and not wanting to have to deal with any of the getting tied up in any of that. U.S. companies have a heavy, heavy presence, and if not a presence, a heavy reliance on Chinese manufacturing.
So what can you give some examples on that, Emily?
Yeah. No, so one example, I mean, think about, so we were just talking about Starlink. We were talking about, what Elon Musk has been doing in Ukraine. Think about Tesla's heavy presence in China. Some of my colleagues at CSET are doing some really excellent work at this, but looking at, I think it was last year, Tesla occupied, I think, 10% of the EV market in China, which for a foreign company is pretty impressive, particularly given China's dominance in EVs. So let's say we, whatever the timeline is, let's say we do see a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. It's hard to say whether or not Elon Musk would decide to actually provide Starlink to Taiwan. And I think there have been really interesting cases or conversations in Taiwan where Taiwanese leadership or experts are actually skeptical that he would provide Starlink because of his heavy ties to China. And for those who don't know, he has Tesla has a massive, massive factory for EVs and batteries in Shanghai that was built up a few years ago, actually in agreement with the Shanghai municipal government. So even if, let's say, Elon Musk wanted to help with Starlink, maybe his ties to the Shanghai government would make it more difficult. Who's to say?
I think Emily makes a great point about the economic dimensions or the economic lessons from the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I think on the one hand, it sparked a very significant conversation in the United States about de-risking. That's sort of the term of art, where there's a whole variety of companies that are looking at reducing their exposure to both manufacturing and sales in China, for fear that if there is a crisis over Taiwan, that they will be unduly exposed. So that de-risking phenomena is going on now. But similarly, the Chinese themselves are doing their own de-risking. Xi Jinping actually started talking about it years ago emphasizing self-reliance. So trying to reduce China's reliance on imports of capital, technology, resources, etc., from countries that might not be terribly reliable. And so I think that when I look at China's energy diplomacy, China's food security diplomacy, I see China building political relationships with countries in the Middle East, Brazil and Latin America, other Latin American countries, to basically ensure that they have secure supplies in the case of a crisis.
And to the point with, many of these other things about what lessons they're taking, the question almost isn't as much how U.S. tech companies would actually respond, how, international companies would actually respond. It's what Beijing's assumptions are about how they would respond. And if they see, Russia with a lot going against it, seeming to have weathered the sanctions, that could be encouraging for them.
Yeah, I think there's also a lesson historically in terms of when people talk about the U.S.'s ability to really curtail China's economic activity. And if you look at the First World War, which was kind of the end of the first period of globalization, you had a case where you had an all-out war between the UK and Germany, and the UK had absolute maritime supremacy outside of the immediate proximity to Germany. And yet, if you read carefully, you'll see it took a year and a half to significantly cut off trade to Germany. It took a lot longer than people expected. And what we saw in that case was, in many cases, economic activity being rerouted through neutral countries because the money is there and it'll happen. And I really am I'm very skeptical that China's trade could be curtailed quickly in any way that really affect them.
Yeah, I think this is what we're struggling now with the conversations around de-risking. I think some folks, particularly in Congress, think that, in some cases you can just flip a switch and, you tell someone, okay, we're telling you that you can no longer invest in Chinese semiconductor companies, remove all of your supply chains, remove all of your investments tomorrow. And then a year from now, they are upset or confused when it turns out that, company X has a supplier, 5 degrees of separation from the final product that they're shipping that has, been, implicated in some issues like weaker forced labor, all these kind of other issues that supply chains, I think, have never really had to reckon with. Companies, if you talk to Apple or you talk to other companies, obviously you take it with a grain of salt, but they do say in a lot of cases that, look, we don't have totally, once the supply chains get into China, and it's not exclusively a China issue, but obviously China is at the forefront of everyone's minds. When you get to the China-based supply chains, things are often obfuscated, things are made more confusing, it's hard to get records, it's hard to kind of navigate that space. So in a lot of cases, I do think companies do have good intentions with trying to do some of this de-risking, both for national security reasons, but also for their own benefit. But it's a lot easier said than done.
So then let me ask, on the semiconductor issue in particular, how effective do you think the U.S. efforts to curtail China's semiconductor industry are going to be? I know you've written about this, Emily. What is the potential diplomatic backlash going to be? And then, Tom, I want to end by asking you, how much of a military difference would these efforts make if they were effective?
So I'm smiling only because the question of the effectiveness of U.S. export controls on semiconductors has been a hot topic as of late, seeing as we're approaching the 1-year anniversary on October 7th of the interim final rule that kind of got all of these efforts kickstarted. There are some signs that the effectiveness of these controls may be in question, but I also think it's too early to tell. I think when you build out export controls that are designed to keep someone indefinitely behind, technology, as technology progresses, the effect is only going to get worse. So only a year out, it's kind of, it's difficult to assess. More broadly, at a fundamental level, I think the question of effectiveness of export controls really depends on the context. I think some people believe that the effectiveness or the most effective export controls will completely destroy a company or will completely gut an industry in a specific country. And I don't necessarily think that's always the case. I think a lot of the times with export controls, to me, if I'm judging the effectiveness of these types of trade controls, I'm looking for whether or not they've imposed cost on the entity in question. Is it more expensive for them to try to achieve is it more expensive for them to try and achieve their objective? Is it taking more time? Do they have to find kind of creative ways to work around things to get to their ultimate objective? Those to me are potential signs of effectiveness, noting that export controls cannot just be you can't really just draw a line in the sand and leave it there. These things have to be adapted as technology progresses and as new developments arise.
Then, of course, there's the issue of unintended consequences.
Yes.
And on chips, my concern is that the October 7 action from last year will, try to create this gap in the most advanced semiconductors, right? 9 nodes and below. But then what that may do is allow China to position itself globally as the largest manufacturer of legacy chips, right? The kind of chips that go into a keyboard or,
Also
earphones.
the chips that are actually being used in military systems right now, because military systems are not using the big, crazy, super advanced chips that are controlled.
Right. And so if China becomes sort of the globally dominant producer of legacy chips, right, much like they came to dominate the production of solar panels, then we've just sort of, created a new vulnerability. And, worse, the Chinese could start dumping those chips on markets all over the world. And so I think that while I'm a supporter of the October 7 rule, and I think it made sense, and I agree with Emily, it's going to need to adapt to be effective. We need to be thinking about the knock-on effects, and the legacy chips piece is going to be an important one to keep an eye on.
And Tom, how much does this matter in strictly military terms?
So I think on the broader scale, it probably matters somewhat in the sense that it helps to undermine the economic activity that is the source ultimately of China's military capability writ large. But while I agree with that, with putting the restrictions in place, I don't think we should fool ourselves that even for the advanced chips, that China can't get those in the numbers they need for weapon systems that are usually built in the hundreds, as opposed to, economic activity like phones that are built in the millions. I mean, I'm not an expert on chips, but I would have to guess that, all the chips that you would need to equip an entire new class of ballistic missiles or hypersonics, you could probably put in a single suitcase that you bought through a shell company. So I don't think it's likely that it's going to keep the PLA, specifically from getting what it needs to equip its weapon systems.
Now, we have to wrap up in just a few minutes here, but before we close out, I wanted to ask you all very briefly, we're having this discussion as the United States goes into an election cycle, started by asking about the current administration's diplomatic approach to China. I want to close by asking you all how the elections here are likely to impact the relationship.
I'll broaden the question a little bit, Nick, because I think that it's important to understand that the U.S. is entering into a period where the entire domestic political landscape toward China is changing.
Yes.
In other words, congressional politics, electoral politics, interest group politics, bureaucratic politics within the government, and public opinion, it's all changing. Changing in a way where it's increasing the pressure on the administration, every administration, to be tougher on China. In other words, very limited space to talk about dialogue, cooperation. And so I think that is going to substantially influence China policy going forward. And I think we're going to see that play out in this presidential election, but also in some of the down ballot elections as well. I mean, I was struck in 2022 during the midterms, for various Senate seats, how prominent China was as an issue. And I think we're going to see that on steroids between the Republican and the Democratic candidate in the 2024 presidential.
I think one of the aspects of the election that I've been focusing on lately is what U.S. allies are thinking about and how they're watching this. I think right now we've reached a very, very tentative consensus around, particularly, as I'm thinking about our allies in Europe, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand. We've all reached this kind of tentative consensus around what to do with China, what to do particularly on AI. I think there's a lot of interest in working together on that issue as well. But the more I talk to allies, particularly in these countries, the more they say that they are worried for what's to come when with the election, and whether or not they should expect some pivots on specific issues, or I think a lot of them are worried about taking a few steps back with a new U.S. president if whoever is elected decides to go off in a different direction.
I will add one knock-on effect is the messier this election is, the more we give China grist for their propaganda effort to characterize the U.S. and democracy in the global South as a bad option.
And we'll certainly be watching that closely. Hopefully it will not be messy. We'll see what happens. In the meantime, thank you all for coming down here and discussing all of this with us.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you again to everyone for listening. I'm reminding you once again that we're launching a bunch of new shows and newsletters next week. So now is the time to sign up, lock in your current membership rate at www.warontherocks.com/membership.